Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to paint Lieutenant Titus from the awesome series Space Marine, the newest being Space Marine 2. So to begin with, I'm using the War Paints Fanatic range. I'm using crystal blue over a McCrag base coat. Now I bought a bunch of Fanatic blue paints, not specifically for this video, but I wanted to just use them as I bought them a while back and never actually used them. So this is my first time actually using them, and I was pleasantly surprised. Although personally they're not my favourite, and I probably won't be getting any more of them, but they are fairly good. But anyway, as I said, I'm using crystal blue over a McCrag base coat, and I'm using the airbrush at 30 psi, and all I'm doing is just spraying from the top, getting a nice even layer, and also hitting some midpoints. Next up, I'm using a 50-50 mix of Arctic Gem and crystal blue. This is just going to act as a intermediary layer and help blend in the next upcoming layers. And again, all I'm doing with this is going from top down and just spraying over all the other locations where I sprayed. Try not to get into any of the shadowy areas and create a nice little beginning of a highlight. Next up, I started shading, and this is where I created a shade. So the shade involves violet ink, Lamy medium, and black. So what I wanted to do was to give the armor a nice little purpley hue in some of the shadows. However, it didn't really turn out that great. It wasn't like the strongest color. I think I needed like a bit of a darker like purple. You can somewhat see it in some of the video, but it's not the best. And in the end I did do an oil recess shade. But I'm going to leave this in here anyway, just in case you guys want to use this and potentially it might go better for you. So next up, I'm just using black, and I'm just going over all of the rubber tubing, the sword, anything that's not the blue armor. However, in the video I don't actually do everything just yet, but I do it in the end. I have a really bad habit of when I paint, I partially do one thing and I jump over to something else and start painting that, and then I jump over to something else. So for instance, I'll do the rubber tubing of the left arm, partially do that, and then I'll jump over to the right leg, and then I'll do casing of the chainsaw, but I do go over everything that's not the blue armor. Also the things that aren't going to be white. Next up, I'm doing edge highlights, and I'm using Arctic Gem. And with this, I usually say you don't need to highlight everything, but in this case, I do go around and highlight all of the arm panels, as I did want to put a lot of effort into this model. Also, write down in the comment sections, but did anyone have issues with building this model? I found it horrible to build. It was one of the worst models I've probably built. I've spoken to a friend who also got the model, and he said it was very difficult to build. It's a little bit of a shame, just because I feel like quite a lot of people want to get this model, and when they get it, it's obviously going to be really difficult to build, especially if it's their first model. Kind of sucks. Alright, now I'm moving over to another intermediary edge highlight, which is Arctic Gem and Bright Sapphire. And for this in particular, I'm just going within the previous edge highlighted areas, and how I usually do is not highlighting the full length of each edge highlight and just doing like the sort of place that is going to catch the most light, and that should bring out some really cool definition. So all I'm doing with this is just using the edge of my brush, just going around. I've loaded up the brush, I've dabbed some of the excess off, and I'm just doing a nice straight edge highlight. So this next part took me quite a while. However, it was really worth doing, as I'll show you in a second, but it's doing all the glazing. Now, I'm not the best at doing glazing, but the medium glaze from Vallejo really helped. So in this instance, I'm using another intermediary layer, which is Arctic Gem and Crystal Blue, and I'm doing this as a 50-50 mix. So the reason I've done this, and I'm not jumping straight to Arctic Gem, is due to the airbrush layer. Obviously, the opacity of the airbrush layer isn't full opacity, so I'm doing a nice glaze over the top and pushing it to the brightest points. So what I mean by this is starting from a darker area and glazing to the brightest area, and that's where I'm going to end my brush stroke. And this is quite a time consuming technique, but it is so worth it, and this model in particular is probably the best blend that I've done. The blue anyway has been the best blend that I've probably ever done. So this is the basic setup that I use as a glaze, and this is the consistency that I use. So as I mentioned, I'm using Arctic Gem for this next highlight, and for this I add 1 drop of Vallejo's glaze medium. So it probably wasn't the best idea to use a very light blue against my pale skin, but hopefully you can see that it's sort of a very translucent layer, and all I'm doing is dabbing off the excess of the paint. So as you just saw, I'm using Arctic Gem and 1 drop of glaze medium, and I'm basically just doing exactly what I've done in the previous layer, but just doing it with Arctic Gem. Again, this is a fairly slow process, but if you want smoother layers, then you do multiple very thin coats. One thing to mention is not to keep going over the same area in a very short amount of time, especially when it's not dry, as you're just going to keep agitating the paint, as it's going to cause and make the blend not very smooth. And again, same thing, different paints, Arctic Gem 50/50 with bright sapphire and glaze medium. So again, I'm just going to be glazing up to where I think the brightest highlights are going to be, and this is another intermediary layer where we will build up to doing a glaze of bright sapphire. So you can absolutely just airbrush this, but I figured I wanted to do a glaze as I personally feel like it looks a lot nicer. Airbrush is more for speed, however I'm not too bothered about like speed painting and all that sort of stuff. I like to take my time and sort of work on my skills. I know a lot of people nowadays are looking for ways to speed up their painting process as they might not have much time, which you can absolutely just use an airbrush if you have an airbrush. But again, I wanted to try push myself on this model a bit more to what I usually do. For the final glaze and edge highlight, I'm just using bright sapphire. For the edge highlight, I'm mainly just doing dotted highlights, and this will be in all of the highest, brightest areas. In terms of the glazing, I'm again just doing it in the brightest, highest point areas. And again, I'm just following all the same steps as I did for all the previous layers. Alright, now that the armor's done, I'm moving on to all the other parts. So I'm starting with the face. And for this, I'm just using Rakkar Flesh, and I'm just giving it a nice solid layer. I wasn't really sure what kind of direction I wanted to take the face, but I kept it somewhat basic with the colours that I'm going to be using. I feel like skin tones are definitely a weak point for me. I then quickly done a nice solid layer of grey cere on all of the white areas. So for me personally, I know that the Ultramarine sign is meant to be gold on front and back, but I decided to keep it white because I thought it gives a nice bit of contrast to the model. So it's just not one solid colour. So in this clip, I'm actually only doing the cloth, but I do the rest of the white areas later down the line. Of all things that I like to paint, I like to do a lot of intermediary layers where I can create like nice blend. So for the second layer of the face, I'm doing Rakkar Flesh, and I'm also using Cadian Skin Tone as a 50/50 mix. And this is just going to be over the entire face. Once you've done that 50/50 mix, you'll then want to go over to Cadian Flesh Tone, and we're just going to be working on doing the highlights and just filling out some of the mid-tone sort of areas. So one thing to mention with this model, I found painting the eyes so difficult for this, which usually I don't really struggle with eyes too much. I obviously don't do them like fully detailed, but I don't not do them, if that makes sense. But I couldn't find a way to comfortable with painting them while recording. So I must have painted them about, I don't know, at this point I think I got up to like almost 10 times I've painted them. I was really not having any luck with this at all. Next I'm just using Kislev Flesh and Cadian Flesh Tone, and I'm just doing this as a 50/50 mix, layering over all the previous mid-tone layers and starting to build up the highlights. So I didn't really want to use any shade or contrast for the face, but in the end I did, so I've probably done this a little bit backwards, and you may want to add the shade here. However, I do it right at the end after I've done all the highlights, which is kind of a weird way of doing it, but it worked anyway, so I'm happy. And the shade I used was Reiklin Flesh Shade. On the second to last highlight, I'm just using Kislev Flesh, and I'm just doing a nice layer over the previous Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh layer. I'm making sure not to go outside of those lines and keeping within the highlights, but I'm really just trying to be careful, do this all slowly and build up the highlights to a nice point where it looks somewhat smooth. And for the brightest highlight, I've used Bright Ivory and Kislev Flesh. And with this, I'm just doing it on all of the brightest highlights. I'm doing sort of dot highlights, very, very small highlighting of the previous Kislev Flesh areas. And as previously mentioned, once all the highlights have been finished and are dry, I then whack over some Reiklin Flesh Shade. If you do it a bit earlier than to what I've done it, you can obviously have brighter highlights. Obviously mine are now dulled down and tinted, which this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I kind of didn't want it tinted. I could have went over again with the highlights again, but I left it as it was. Next is a fairly quick step. I'm just using my fist on red, and I'm just going around all the red areas. For this is just the symbol on his right shoulder pad and the wax for the purity seals. All I'm doing is just a nice solid layer on all of that. Time to start on all the metallic areas, and for this I'm using Retributor Gold for all of the gold areas. This will be the Aquila, the shoulder pads, belt, and the little thing that he carries that has a little bone in it. I don't really know what it's called. For metallics, I like to use a separate metallic brush that I use. It's just a Citadel Layer brush, and I also use a separate water pot for metallics as well. Reasons because you can get the metallic flecks onto the regular acrylics, so I like to keep them separate. Once the Retributor Gold is fully dry, I then use Reglin Flesh Shade and put it all over on all of the gold areas, and this is going to add some definition and give us a nice little tint to the gold. While that shade is drying, I then use Lead Belcher for all of the silver metallics. So again, as I previously mentioned, I don't paint everything. So for instance, the chains, I actually leave them to the very end. I paint part of it and then I just leave it till the very end. But obviously in your case you might want to paint them all right now. Once all the metallics are done, then jump over to the leather and just use a basic recipe, which is Rhinox hide. Leather is definitely another weak spot which I need to look into getting better at, as well as skin tone. But all I'm doing here is just another solid layer of Rhinox hide for all of the pouches and the belt. Jumping back to the white areas again, I'm using Soulblight Grey shade, and I'm just throwing that all over all of the white areas. So this is a fairly quick and easy step and shouldn't take too much time. However, just remember that you don't want to overload the brush too much and leave any sort of excess puddles, as it will cause nasty looking rings. So we're just jumping back over to the gold, and I'm using Liberator Gold to do the highlights. So I'm highlighting all the gold areas with this, and I'm trying to target all of the sort of brighter highlighted areas. I will be doing one extra layer of highlights, which will be a silver, which this should be a fairly short process to do. But of course we want to be taking our time and making sure that we're hitting the correct areas and trying to make sure that we don't spill over onto any of the armor panels that we've already painted. So again, with this, just take your time and don't rush anything. Now jumping back over to the silver, I'm now dulling it down with some Nuln Oil. So the reason why I'm doing this, I'm not doing the final highlight of the gold, is because I'm going to be highlighting the silver with the silver that I'm going to be also highlighting with the gold. So again, with the Nuln Oil, you don't want to use too much, as you don't want any drying stains, but we're just going to be applying this to all of the silver areas and also the red areas as well. So while that shade is all drying, I decided to add some hazard stripes to the chainsword. And the way I set this up is using some masking tape, and as you can see I've added 5 bits and I'm going to be doing 2 hazard stripes, and all I'm doing is taking away the second and fourth strips of masking tape. So this is a really easy way of getting some nice inline hazard stripes. As you saw, these aren't set in stone, so you can adjust them if you need, but all I'm doing is adding a nice solid layer of white, and then I'm just going to be whacking some yellow over the top. But you want to make sure that the masking tape is nicely stuck down, otherwise if you don't, you can have some like seeping issues of the white paint. If you do have any issues with seeping underneath the masking tape, you can just clear it up with the black. Onto the first highlight for the white, I'm using Ultramarine Grey, and for painting white you want to use greys, as it gives more depth and definition to the white, whereas if you just paint straight white it doesn't look good. But all I'm doing with the Ultramarine Grey is putting it onto the highest points where I think the highlights will be, and I'm just using a volumetric method of shading and highlighting it up. Jumping back to the hazard stripes, I'm just using Avalon Sunset, and I'm just doing a nice layer over the top of that white that we painted. This should go on fairly smoothly as we're not painting yellow over black, and you can use a nice thin layer. Again, take your time, you don't really want to be overflowing onto the black, but if you do, then you can just clean up with some black. However, then you're just going to have to be careful with trying not to hit the hazard stripes again. For the final highlight on the cloth, I'm using Bold Titanium White, and I'm just doing again another volumetric highlight and some edge highlighting. So I'm just going within the Ultramarine Grey and just painting a smaller surface area within that previous highlight. Alright, so as previously mentioned, the purple and black shading that I tried to do previously, it didn't really come out the way I wanted it to come out, and what I decided to do was just to use a black oil and do some recess shading. So in this instance I didn't actually use any varnishes, I just went straight in with the oil. So this is only for the blue armor panels, and I just went around all of the edges of the armor and in all of the recesses, and it did definitely define the armor panels a lot more. However, I am kind of sad that the purple and black didn't out how I wanted it. I've got the kill team to paint after this, so I'm probably going to be doing Ultramarines kill team. And I'm definitely going to try the purple shading again. But this oil should just go on nice and quick, and it shouldn't be too messy at all. Obviously, feel free to use any varnish if you want to use gloss varnish to help with the spreading of the oil. Back to the red. Since I dulled down the red with the non-oil, I'm coming back in with some Fist on Red to bring up the vibrancy again. This will just help with a nicer transition to the highlights. So once the Mephiston on Red is dry, we come back in with Evil Sun Scarlet, and this is going to be the highlight. And since we applied a fresh layer of Mephiston on Red, this should be a fairly easy transition, as these two colours work really, really nicely together. So again, I'm just doing some edge highlighting and some volumetric highlights. Just add a bit of contrast to the yellow, I use a very watered down snakebite leather, and all I'm doing is just dragging from top downwards. So this is going to give the yellow a nice tint and give it some contrast. As I am dragging this over the black, I do come in with just regular black paint and just paint over the black again. To paint the purity seals, I'm just whacking over some skeleton horde. I'm not doing anything with this, I'm just using a nice thin layer and just painting over each of the purity seals. And I'm also painting over the skull on the shoulder pad. So again, I'm not loading the brush up too much, as I don't want to create any sort of dry spots, and I'm just doing one nice thin layer over the top. Once that skeleton horde is dry on the purity seals, I then just get a black and I do thin little lines to simulate text. However, I didn't actually video this, but all you will need is a nice fine tipped brush and some thin down black, and you should be good to go. For the final highlights, I'm using Stormhost Silver, and this is going to be the final highlight for all the metallics, so that includes both gold and silver. So with this, I'm just doing some very fine edge highlights and some dotted highlights over the gold, and mostly sort of volumetric highlights for the silver metallic. So just to edge highlight all the black areas, I'm using Skaven Blight Dinge, and this is going to be the highlight for the chainsword casing, gun casing, and the black rubber tubing, and any other sort of black areas that I may have missed. And we're doing a fairly thick highlight with this, and then we're going to be doing another highlight straight after. For the final black edge highlight, I'm using Storm Vermin Fur, and I'm just going to be doing edge highlighting for this, no volumetric work. I'm just going to be going over all of the sort of areas where I've done Skaven Blight Dinge. I like using these colours on black, as it's kind of like a dull colour and it's not very standout-ish and distracts the attention. To say how you want it on like Black Templars or something like that, using a very much brighter grey. So as I mentioned previously, I'm not very good at painting leather, but for this leather recipe, it obviously starts off as Rhinox Hide, and then we're moving on to Gorefall Brown. Which for this, I start off just doing some edge highlights, and then I figured I might as well just do the whole thing and just volumetrically highlight the whole thing, which in my opinion looks a bit better than, since the whole model that I've painted is mostly volumetrically highlighted, I just decided to do all the leather as well. So I don't have any intermediary layers on here, I'm just going straight Gorefall Brown, and I'm painting that, leaving some spacings because there is some sort of divots and little bits of recesses within the leather itself. I definitely think I'm going to be working on leather and skin tones in the coming year. I've got some competitions that I want to enter, which I've never actually done a competition before, but it seems quite fun, so I'm going to try it out. And for the final highlight, I'm using Bane Blade Brown, and I'm just doing exactly the same, just covering less of the Gorefall Brown. So I'm just making sure to get a nice solid layer over the previous Gorefall Brown layer. And I'm also making sure just to edge highlight all of the leather pouches and the belt. And then that is the final part of painting Titus. I just want to say thank you to everyone that has watched the video this far. If you like the video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoyed my content, then hit that subscribe button. If there's any further videos that you want to see, then please just leave it down in the comment section. Here's a few more of my videos that you might enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.